The Dinner Invitation, Chapter 1, The Call. The rain drummed against the windows of Frank Morrison's modest apartment in downtown Detroit. At 62, his calloused hands told the story of decades spent working construction, factory lines, and whatever honest work he could find after the plant closures of the early 2000s. The apartment was sparse but clean, a worn leather recliner facing an old TV, a small kitchen table for one, and walls bare except for a single photograph he couldn't bring himself to remove, his daughter Sarah at her high school graduation 15 years ago. Frank had just returned from his shift at the hardware store when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't in his contacts, but something about the area code made his heart skip. Michigan. Metro Detroit area. Hello? His voice was cautious. Dad? The word hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah's voice, older now, more confident, but unmistakably hers. Sarah? His hand trembled as he gripped the phone tighter. Yeah, it's me. There was a pause, heavy with 15 years of silence. I saw the news about your lottery win. Congratulations. Frank's jaw tightened. 3 weeks ago, his life had changed forever when his numbers came up. $47 million after taxes. The local news had run the story. Detroit construction worker wins big, complete with his photo at the lottery office, holding an oversized check. Is that why you're calling? The words came out harsher than he intended. Sarah faltered. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner. Catch up. There's this nice place in Birmingham, Antonio's. Saturday at 7? Birmingham. Of course she'd suggest Birmingham, one of the wealthiest suburbs in Michigan, the kind of place Frank could never afford to take her when she was growing up. I suppose I can make time, he said, though his chest felt tight. Great, I'll make a reservation. See you then, Dad. The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at his phone. 15 years. Not a single word during his darkest days, when he'd lost the house, when her mother died, when he'd lived in his car for 3 months. But now, 3 weeks after his lottery win, suddenly she wanted to catch up. Chapter 2. The weight of memory Saturday evening found Frank sitting in his 10-year-old Ford pickup outside Antonio's Italian restaurant. Through the large windows, he could see the warm glow of candlelit tables, couples in designer clothes and servers in crisp uniforms. His reflection stared back at him from the passenger window, gray hair neatly combed, his one good suit pressed, shoes polished to a shine. He looked respectable enough, but inside, he felt like an imposter. The valet approached his truck with barely concealed disdain. Sir, will you be dining with us this evening? Yeah, Frank said, climbing out. Frank Morrison. Party of 2. Of course, sir. We'll take good care of your vehicle. Frank caught the smirk but said nothing. He'd faced worse than snobbery. Inside, the maitre d' led him to a corner table where Sarah was already seated. Frank's breath caught. She looked so much like her mother, the same auburn hair, now styled in an expensive cut, the same green eyes, but there was something different, something harder in her expression that hadn't been there at 18. Dad. She stood. And for a moment, he thought she might hug him. Instead, she offered a handshake. Professional. Distant. You look good, sweetheart, Frank said, meaning it. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent, paired with jewelry that caught the light. Success looked good on her. Thank you. You too. Her smile was practiced, the kind she probably used with clients. I took the liberty of ordering wine. The sommelier recommended the Barolo. Frank had no idea what that meant, but he nodded. Sounds fancy. They sat in awkward silence as the server poured wine that cost more per glass than Frank used to spend on groceries for a week. Sarah raised her glass. To new beginnings? Frank clinked his glass against hers but didn't drink. So, what do you do now? For work, I mean. I'm a partner at Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, corporate law. She paused. I kept Mom's maiden name. Morrison. The implication stung, but Frank kept his face neutral. Your mother would be proud. She always said you were the smartest one in the family. Sarah's composure cracked, just for a second. She died 5 years ago, Dad. Did you even know? I knew. Frank's voice was quiet. I was at the funeral. You were? Sarah's surprise was genuine. Back row, left before the service ended. Didn't think you'd want to see me there. Sarah stared at him, something shifting in her expression. The server appeared to take their order, and Sarah automatically ordered the most expensive items on the menu. The lobster thermidor, the Wagyu beef appetizer. Frank ordered the chicken parmigiana, the most familiar thing he could find. Chapter 3. 15 Years of Silence. So, Sarah said once the server left, $47 million. That's quite a windfall. $47 million after taxes, Frank corrected. 58 before. And what do you plan to do with it? Frank studied his daughter's face. There was something calculating there, something that reminded him uncomfortably of his ex-wife's sister, Margaret, who'd always looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Haven't decided yet. Maybe buy a little house somewhere. Nothing fancy. That's modest of you. Sarah twisted her engagement ring. A rock that must have cost 20 grand, Frank estimated. You could do so much more. Invest it properly. Make it work for you. Like you did? What's that supposed to mean? Frank leaned back in his chair. You tell me, sweetheart. 15 years. Not a word. Not when I lost the house. Not when your mother got sick. Not when I was sleeping in my truck outside the Walmart. But 3 weeks after I win the lottery, suddenly you want to have dinner. Sarah's cheeks flushed. You lost the house because you couldn't hold down a job. Mom got sick because you couldn't afford proper health insurance. You were homeless because you drank away every paycheck. Is that what she told you? She didn't have to tell me anything. I lived it, Dad. I watched you stumble home drunk more nights than I can count. I watched Mom work 2 jobs to keep food on the table while you blamed everyone else for your problems. Frank felt the familiar weight of old accusations, old guilt. But something had changed in him over the past 15 years. Maybe it was hitting bottom so hard he'd bounce back. Maybe it was the 7 years he'd been sober. Maybe it was just being 62 and too tired to carry other people's version of his story. Your mother ever tell you why I drank? Because you're weak. The words hit like a slap, but Frank didn't flinch. I started drinking the day I found out your mother was having an affair. Sarah went very still. That's not true. With her boss at the real estate office, Richard Hendricks. Remember him? Came to your graduation, shook my hand, told me what a fine daughter I had. You're lying. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope worn with age. Found these in your mother's things after she died. She'd hidden them in the attic. He slid several photographs across the table. Sarah's hand shook as she picked them up. Her mother and Richard Hendricks embracing outside a hotel, kissing in his car, holding hands at a restaurant Frank couldn't afford. She was going to leave me, Frank continued, his voice steady, had papers drawn up and everything. But then she found out she was pregnant. Sarah looked up sharply. Pregnant? You had a little brother on the way. She lost the baby at 5 months. Doctor said it was stress. Frank's voice cracked slightly. She blamed me for the miscarriage. Said if I hadn't found out about Richard, if I hadn't confronted her, hadn't made her choose. She never forgave me for that baby, Sarah, and neither did I. The photographs scattered as Sarah's hands shook. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That your mother cheated? That we lost a baby? That I wasn't strong enough to handle it without crawling into a bottle? Frank shook his head. I was 34 years old when I found those pictures. And I didn't know how to be a man about it, so I became a drunk instead. But you let me think. All these years, I thought. You thought I was a failure, a deadbeat, a drunk who couldn't provide for his family. Frank nodded. And I was all those things. Finding out about your mother didn't excuse what I became, but it explains it. Chapter 4. The Cost of Truth. Their food arrived, but neither of them touched it. Sarah stared at the photographs, tears threatening to spill over. The restaurant buzzed around them, the sound of silverware against china, muted conversations, the soft jazz playing over the speakers. But at their table, 15 years of silence had exploded into painful truth. She used to talk about how disappointed she was in you, Sarah said quietly, how you'd given up, how you'd rather drink than fight for your family. She wasn't wrong, but she was sleeping with another man while she said those things. People are complicated, sweetheart. Your mother wasn't evil. She was lonely, trapped in a marriage with a man who'd checked out. Richard offered her something I couldn't: stability, success, a future without worry. So why didn't she leave? Frank was quiet for a long moment, because despite everything, I think part of her still loved me, and she knew I loved you more than my own life. Then why did you leave? After graduation, you just disappeared. Because you made it clear you didn't want me in your life anymore. Remember? You told me you were ashamed of me, that you hoped you'd never turn out like your old man. Sarah winced. I was 18. I was angry. You were right. I was something to be ashamed of. So I figured the best thing I could do was get out of your way, let you build whatever life you wanted without having to explain away your drunk father. I waited for you to call. The admission was barely a whisper, but it hit Frank like thunder. What? For months after I started college, I waited. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time something good happened or something went wrong, I kept thinking you'd call. I thought about it every day for the first 5 years. But I figured, what did I have to offer? I was working construction when I could find it, living in a one-room apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage. You were at U of M studying law. You had a future. I had a father. The words hung between them, heavy with 15 years of missed birthdays, unshared triumphs and failures, grandchildren Frank had never met. Do you have kids? Frank asked suddenly. Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone. Tyler is 12. Emma is 8. She showed him photos, a boy with Frank's dark hair and serious expression, a girl with Sarah's green eyes and mischievous smile. They're beautiful. Do they know about me? I told them their grandfather died before they were born. Another blow, but Frank absorbed it. Easier that way. Was it? Was it easier? Sarah's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Because I've spent 15 years lying to my children about where they came from. 15 years making up stories about a grandfather who died a hero instead of explaining why their real grandfather was too ashamed to be part of their lives. I wasn't ashamed of you, Sarah. I was ashamed of me. Well, congratulations, Dad. Your shame cost Tyler and Emma their grandfather. It cost me my father during my wedding, during the hardest parts of raising kids, during every moment when I needed someone to tell me I was doing okay. Frank felt something break inside his chest. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 15 years. They sat in silence again, the weight of lost time pressing down on them. Finally, Sarah spoke. The lottery win. How does it feel? Strange, surreal. 3 weeks ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I've got more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. And now I'm here. Now you're here. Sarah met his eyes. You think I'm only here because of the money? It wasn't a question, but Frank answered anyway. Are you? Chapter 5. The Reckoning. Sarah was quiet for so long Frank thought she might not answer. She pushed food around her plate, avoiding his gaze. I've been following your story for years, she said finally. What? Online, social media. I have Google alerts set up for your name." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I knew when you got sober 7 years ago. I knew when you started working at Morrison Hardware. Yes, I noticed it had Mom's maiden name. I knew when you moved into that apartment on Cass Avenue. I knew about the community college classes you've been taking." Frank stared at her, speechless. "I knew you were at Mom's funeral. I saw you leave. I wanted to follow you, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "I was afraid you'd reject me, afraid you'd think I was just trying to ease my guilt." "Were you?" "Partly." She smiled sadly. "But mostly, I missed my dad, even the broken version of him." Frank's throat felt thick. "Then why wait until now? Why the lottery win?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I'm a coward. Because it's easier to reach out when you have something to offer. Because—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Because my marriage is falling apart. And I realized I'm about to become a single mother, and I thought maybe my kids deserve to know they have a grandfather who might actually stick around this time." The honesty of it hit Frank like a physical blow. "Sarah, David's been cheating on me for 2 years. I found out last month." She touched her engagement ring again. "Turns out I'm better at prosecuting adultery than preventing it." "I'm sorry." "Are you?" "Because the irony isn't lost on me. My mother cheated, and I married a cheater. My father abandoned me, and I'm about to be abandoned." She looked up at him. "Maybe I called you because I wanted to see if you'd do it again, disappear when things get complicated." Frank reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were cold. "I'm not going anywhere this time." "You say that now, but what happens when the novelty wears off? When you remember why you left in the first place?" "I left because I thought you were better off without me. If you're telling me you weren't, then I don't have any reason to leave." Sarah stared down at their joined hands. "The money doesn't matter to you, does it? It's nice not to worry about rent. But no, it doesn't matter. Not compared to this. I make good money, Dad. Partner track at the firm. The house is paid off. I don't need your lottery winnings." "I never thought you did." "Then why do you look like you don't believe me?" Frank considered the question seriously. "Because for 15 years, you didn't need me either, and that was fine. But the moment I had something valuable to offer, suddenly you needed to catch up." Sarah pulled her hand away. "That's not fair, isn't it? I told you I've been thinking about calling for years, but you didn't. Not until I won the lottery." "Because I'm human," Sarah's voice cracked. "Because I'm flawed and scared, and I've spent 15 years convincing myself that you didn't want me in your life. The lottery win wasn't about the money. It was about having an excuse, a reason to reach out that didn't make me vulnerable." Frank studied his daughter's face, seeing the frightened little girl underneath the successful lawyer's facade. "You want to know what I've been doing with the money so far?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "I've been sitting in that apartment, staring at your graduation photo, trying to figure out how to call you. The money didn't make me brave, sweetheart. It just made the fear of losing you again bigger than the fear of being rejected." Chapter 6. The Choice. They ordered dessert they didn't want and coffee that grew cold as they talked. Sarah told him about Tyler's baseball games and Emma's dance recitals, about the small law firm she'd built from nothing, about the house in Bloomfield Hills that felt too big and too empty now that David was gone. Frank told her about his 7 years of sobriety, about the AA meetings in church basements, about the night classes in accounting and business management he'd been taking, just to keep the brain working. He told her about the photographs of her grandchildren he'd found on Facebook, how he'd printed them out and kept them in his wallet like any grandfather would. "You could have reached out any time," Sarah said. "I never blocked your number, never told anyone not to give you my address." "Would you have answered?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, maybe. Probably not at first. That's why I didn't call. Better to wonder what might have been than to know for certain I wasn't wanted." "And now?" Now I'm sitting across from my daughter for the first time in 15 years, and she's more beautiful and successful than I ever imagined, and I'm terrified she's going to walk out of here and I'll never see her again. Sarah looked around the restaurant, at the other diners enjoying their meals, at the servers moving efficiently between tables, at the normal world continuing around their extraordinary conversation. Tyler asks about his grandfather sometimes, the one who's supposedly dead. What do you tell him? I tell him his grandfather was complicated, that he loved his family but didn't always know how to show it, that sometimes good people make bad choices. Frank smiled sadly. Sounds about right. He looks like you know. Tyler. He has your stubborn streak and your tendency to brood when he's upset. And Emma. Emma has your sense of humor. She makes these terrible puns that remind me of jokes you used to tell when I was little. The memory hit Frank unexpectedly. Sarah, at 6 years old, giggling at his silly wordplay, begging for, "Just one more, Daddy, please." "I remember those jokes," he said softly. "I taught them to her, all of them. I couldn't help myself." They looked at each other across the table. 15 years of hurt and longing and regret hanging between them like fog. "I want to meet them," Frank said. "If you'll let me." "It's not that simple. They think you're dead. How do I explain that I lied?" "You tell them the truth, that their grandfather made mistakes and was too ashamed to be part of their lives, but that he never stopped loving them, even though he'd never met them. And if they hate me for lying, kids are more forgiving than adults. They'll be angry for a while, but they'll get over it. The question is, can you forgive yourself?" Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. "I've been so angry at you for so long, I forgot how to be anything else." "I know the feeling. Do we even know how to be father and daughter anymore?" Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I've got pictures of every birthday cake you never got from me. 15 candles, 16, 17, all the way up to 33. I bought them every year and took pictures before I threw them away." Sarah stared at him. "You're kidding." "I've got them on my phone. Want to see?" She nodded, and Frank scrolled through years of sad, solitary birthday cakes, each one decorated with the number of candles Sarah would have blown out if he'd been brave enough to call. "This is the saddest thing I've ever seen," Sarah said, but she was smiling through her tears. "Yeah, well, I was pretty pathetic for a while there." "Were you really homeless?" "For about 6 months, yeah. Lost the apartment when the factory closed. Lived in my truck until I could save enough for a deposit on the place I'm in now." "I could have helped if you'd called. You were in law school. You had your own problems. I was your daughter. I would have figured it out." Frank looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman she'd become. Strong, successful, independent, but also wounded and lonely and afraid. Still his little girl underneath it all. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Shoot. If I hadn't won the lottery, would we be sitting here?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Eventually, yes. The divorce would have pushed me to reach out, but it might have taken years. And by then, she shrugged. By then, maybe it would have been too late. "It's not too late now." "Isn't it? I'm 33 years old, Dad. I built a whole life without you. My kids don't know you exist. I don't know how to be your daughter anymore." "We'll figure it out." "Will we?" "What happens when the story gets old? When you remember all the reasons you left in the first place?" Frank signaled the server for the check. "There was only one reason I left, sweetheart. I thought you'd be better off without me. If that's not true, then the reason doesn't exist anymore." Chapter 7. New Beginnings. The check arrived, $347 for a meal neither of them had really eaten. Frank pulled out his wallet, but Sarah stopped him. "Let me get this one. I invited you." A daughter shouldn't have to pay for dinner with her father. A father shouldn't have to disappear for 15 years to protect his daughter's feelings. Frank let her pay. Outside the restaurant, they stood awkwardly by the valet stand. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. "So," Sarah said, "what happens now?" "I'd like to meet my grandchildren." "And I'd like that too, but slowly. Tyler's at a difficult age, and Emma, she's going to have a lot of questions." "I understand. Maybe we could start with coffee. Just the two of us. Work our way up to family dinner." Frank smiled. "I'd like that. Saturday mornings work for me. There's a Starbucks on Woodward near my office." "I don't drink coffee." "Then order hot chocolate or tea or whatever you want, Dad. The point is to spend time together." Dad. The word sounded strange after 15 years, but also achingly familiar. "Sarah? Yeah? I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to be, but I am. You turned out better than I ever dreamed." Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment she was 18 again, standing in their living room in her graduation gown, telling him she was ashamed to be his daughter. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what I said when I was 18, for not calling, for letting pride keep us apart for so long. I'm sorry, too, for all of it." They hugged then, tentatively at first, then tighter. Frank breathed in the scent of his daughter's perfume and felt something in his chest that had been broken for 15 years begin to heal. "Dad?" "Yeah, sweetheart. The lottery money. What are you really going to do with it?" Frank pulled back to look at her. "I was thinking about setting up college funds for Tyler and Emma. Maybe buying a house with a big backyard where they could visit their grandfather. Maybe taking some of those business classes I've been putting off and opening a little hardware store of my own." "That sounds perfect. And Sarah, if you need help with anything, the divorce, the kids, whatever, you just have to ask. I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now." "I know. And Dad? Yeah? I love you. I never stopped, even when I hated you." Frank felt tears prick his eyes. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." The valet brought Sarah's BMW around, a sleek silver sedan that probably cost more than Frank had made in his best year. She tipped the young man and turned back to her father. "Saturday at 10, the Starbucks on Woodward? I'll be there. And Dad, next time, let's go somewhere less fancy. Maybe that diner you used to take me to when I was little. Mickey's, wasn't it?" "Mickey's closed down about 5 years ago." "Then we'll find somewhere new, somewhere we can talk without worrying about other people listening." Frank watched his daughter drive away, her taillights disappearing into the Detroit night. Then he climbed into his old pickup truck and sat for a moment, processing everything that had happened. 15 years of silence. Broken by a dinner invitation and a lottery ticket. 15 years of assuming the worst about each other, healed by the simple act of telling the truth. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Thank you for dinner, Dad. See you Saturday. P.S. I kept all those terrible jokes. Still tell them to my kids." Frank smiled and typed back, "Looking forward to Saturday. P.S. I've got 15 years worth of new terrible jokes to share." As he drove home through the familiar streets of Detroit, Frank Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, hope. The lottery money had bought him a lot of things, but it hadn't bought him this moment, this reunion, this chance to be a father and grandfather again. That had cost him nothing but the courage to show up and tell the truth. Epilogue. 1 year later. The backyard of Frank Morrison's new house in Royal Oak buzzed with activity. Tyler, now 13, was teaching his grandfather how to throw a curveball, both of them laughing as Frank's attempts sailed wide of the strike zone they'd marked on the garage door. Emma, 9 now, sat at the picnic table with Sarah, both of them working on a puzzle Frank had bought during his latest trip to the toy store, something that had become a weekly tradition. The house wasn't large, but it was comfortable, with a guest room for when the kids wanted to stay overnight and a workshop in the basement where Frank had been teaching Tyler woodworking. The hardware store was doing well, Morrison & Son Hardware, though Tyler had informed his grandfather he planned to be a baseball player, not a hardware salesman. "That's okay," Frank had told him. "We'll change it to Morrison and Grandson Baseball Academy." Sarah looked up from the puzzle, watching her father and son play catch. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, and while it hadn't been easy, having her father's support had made all the difference. He'd been there for every lawyer meeting, every difficult conversation with the kids, every moment when she doubted herself as a mother. "He's good with them," David had said during one of their custody exchanges, nodding toward Frank, who was patiently helping Emma with her math homework at the kitchen table. "He is," Sarah had agreed, feeling no need to explain the 15 years that had come before this. That was ancient history now. "Grandpa Frank," Emma called from the table. "Come see, we finished the puzzle." Frank jogged over, leaving Tyler to practice his pitching motion. The puzzle was a picture of a lighthouse, bright and sturdy against stormy seas. "Beautiful work, Princess," Frank said, kissing the top of Emma's head. "What do you say we frame this one for the refrigerator?" "All the puzzles won't fit on the refrigerator," Emma pointed out practically. "Then we'll have to get a bigger refrigerator." Sarah smiled, watching her father with her children. The man who'd been too broken to be a father had somehow become the perfect grandfather. Maybe that was how life worked sometimes. You got a second chance to be who you were meant to be all along. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from his sponsor at AA. "How's the family barbecue?" Frank typed back, "Perfect. Thanks for pushing me to make that call. You made the call. I just reminded you that you were worth forgiving." Frank looked around his backyard, at his daughter helping his granddaughter with a puzzle, at his grandson perfecting his curveball, at the life he'd built from scratch after winning a lottery that had nothing to do with money. Sometimes the best things in life weren't about getting lucky. Sometimes they were about getting brave enough to reach out, tell the truth, and trust that love could survive anything, even 15 years of silence. "Dad," Sarah called, "Tyler wants to know if you're going to make your famous burgers for dinner." "Famous burgers coming right up," Frank called back, heading toward the grill. As he flipped the burgers and listened to his family's laughter, Frank Morrison thought about the man he'd been 15 years ago, drunk, broken, convinced he was better off alone. That man would never have believed this moment was possible. But here it was, anyway, grilled to perfection and served with love, forgiveness, and just the right amount of hope for tomorrow. The lottery ticket had been worth $47 million. This moment was priceless. Chapter 8: The Unexpected Visit. 2 years after their reunion, Frank was in his workshop when the doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon and Tyler was at baseball practice while Emma was at dance class. Sarah wouldn't be picking them up for another hour. Frank wiped the sawdust from his hands and headed upstairs. Through the peephole, he saw a woman he didn't recognize, mid-50s, well-dressed, with nervous energy that reminded him of someone. "Can I help you?" he asked through the door. "Mr. Morrison? Frank Morrison?" The woman's voice was shaky. "My name is Margaret Hendricks. I think we need to talk." The name hit Frank like a cold wave. Hendricks. Richard Hendricks, the man his wife had the affair with. This had to be his wife. Frank opened the door slowly. Margaret Hendricks was attractive in the way wealthy suburban women often were. Manicured, styled, carefully maintained. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "Mrs. Hendricks," Frank said carefully, "what can I do for you? May I come in? Please. This is very difficult for me." Against his better judgment, Frank stepped aside. Margaret entered and looked around the comfortable living room, the family photos on the mantel, Tyler's baseball trophies on the bookshelf, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator. "You have a lovely home," she said. "Thank you. Can I offer you some coffee, water?" "Coffee would be nice." They sat at Frank's kitchen table, the same one where he helped Emma with her homework every Tuesday. Margaret wrapped her hands around her mug like she was trying to warm herself. I know this is strange, she began, showing up here after all these years. But Richard died last month. I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret laughed bitterly. Are you? Really? Because he destroyed your marriage. Frank studied her face. Did he destroy yours too? In a way. Margaret set down her coffee cup. Mr. Morrison, there are things you don't know. Things about Richard and your wife, Linda. Mrs. Hendricks, that was 20 years ago. Whatever happened between them, it's ancient history now. No, it's not. Margaret's voice was urgent. Because it's still affecting people. It's still hurting people. Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest. What are you talking about? Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Richard kept everything. Every letter, every photo, every piece of evidence of their relationship. I found it all when I was going through his things. She slid the envelope across the table. Frank stared at it but didn't touch it. I already know about the affair, Mrs. Auntie Hendricks. I have photos. I've made my peace with it. This isn't about the affair. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Morrison, did Linda ever tell you why she lost the baby? The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Stress. The doctor said it was stress from our fighting about the affair. Margaret shook her head slowly. Richard told me everything before he died. He had cancer and I think the guilt was eating him alive. What guilt? Linda didn't lose the baby because of stress, Mr. Morrison. She lost the baby because Richard convinced her to have an abortion. The world tilted. Frank gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. That's not possible. Linda wanted that baby. She was devastated when she lost it. She was devastated because she regretted her decision. Richard told her if she had your baby, he'd never leave his wife for her. He gave her an ultimatum, him or the baby. Frank stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward. You're lying. I wish I was. Margaret opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. This is from Linda to Richard 3 days after the procedure. She wrote that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd chosen him over her own child and her marriage, and she could never forgive herself. Frank's hands shook as he took the letter. Linda's handwriting, her words. Her pain bleeding through the ink. Richard, I can't stop crying. I can't stop thinking about what we did. Frank will never forgive me if he finds out, and I'll never forgive myself. I killed our baby for you, and now I don't know how to live with that. I can't look at him anymore. I can't pretend this was a miscarriage. What have we done? Frank sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. 20 years. 20 years of thinking his wife had lost their baby because of his inability to handle her affair with Grace. 20 years of guilt, of drinking, of believing he was responsible for the death of his child. There's more, Margaret said quietly. Richard never intended to leave me. He told Linda he would, but he was lying. He was using her, Mr. Morrison. And when she realized that, when she understood she'd given up everything for a man who saw her as a convenience, she ended the affair. When? About 6 months before Sarah graduated high school, Linda tried to repair her marriage to you, but she couldn't live with what she'd done. The guilt consumed her. Frank thought about those last months before Sarah's graduation. Linda had been different. More attentive, more desperate somehow. He'd assumed she was trying to make up for the affair. He'd never imagined she was trying to make up for murder. Why are you telling me this? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret wiped her eyes. Because Richard's confession didn't just involve Linda. There were other women over the years, other ultimatums, other procedures. She paused. One of them was my daughter. Frank looked up sharply. My daughter, Jessica. She was 22, working as Richard's assistant. He got her pregnant and convinced her to handle it. She never told me until Richard was dying and the truth came out. Margaret's voice cracked. She's never been the same. The guilt, the shame. She's been in therapy for years. I'm sorry, Frank said, meaning it. I'm not looking for sympathy, Mr. Morrison. I'm looking for justice, or at least accountability. Richard's dead. What kind of accountability? Not for Richard, for Linda. Frank stared at her. Linda's been dead for 7 years, but her daughter isn't. The implication hit Frank like a sledgehammer. Sarah doesn't know. Does she deserve to? Frank stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his backyard where Tyler and Emma played every weekend, where Sarah laughed and helped with puzzles and slowly healed from her own divorce. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to help me understand if the truth is worth more than peace." Frank turned back to Margaret. "What do you mean?" "My daughter Jessica wants to go public. She wants to file charges against Richard's estate, expose what he did to multiple women over the years. She's found 3 other victims willing to testify." "Good for her." "Linda's name will come up. The abortion will become public record. Sarah will find out her mother killed her baby brother for a man who was manipulating her." Frank felt the air leave his lungs. Sarah had just started to heal from 15 years of believing her father was a failure. Now this woman wanted to destroy her memory of her mother, too. That would destroy Sarah. Maybe. Or maybe it would free her. Maybe knowing the truth about her mother's guilt would help her understand why Linda was so hard on you, why she blamed you for everything, why she could never forgive herself enough to be happy. Frank sank back into his chair. Sarah's been through enough. And my daughter hasn't? And the other women Richard manipulated haven't? Margaret leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not asking you to decide. I'm asking you to help me think through this. You knew Linda, you know Sarah. Is the truth always better than a lie?" Chapter 9. The Weight of Secrets. Frank stared at the letter in his hands for a long time after Margaret left. Linda's handwriting, her pain, her regret. It was all there in black ink on yellowed paper. 20 years of carrying the wrong guilt, 20 years of drinking to numb the pain of thinking he'd caused his wife to lose their baby. But what was the alternative? Let Sarah live with the truth that her mother had chosen her lover over her own child. That the miscarriage that defined so much of their family's tragedy was actually an abortion? His phone rang. Sarah. "Hey, Dad, I'm running about 15 minutes late picking up the kids. Tyler's coach wanted to talk about summer league. And you know how coaches can be." "No problem, sweetheart. They're not here yet anyway." "Everything okay? You sound strange." Frank looked at the letter spread out on his kitchen table. "Just tired. Long day at the store." "Well, don't let Emma talk you into too much ice cream before dinner. She's been testing boundaries lately." "I'll be strong." Sarah laughed. "You're about as strong as tissue paper when it comes to that little girl, and we both know it." After they hung up, Frank walked to his workshop and called his AA sponsor, Jim. "I need to talk," Frank said without preamble. "Bad day?" "Complicated day. Can you meet me at Mickey's Replacement? That diner on 8 Mile? Give me 20 minutes. Frank had been sober for 9 years now, but moments like this still made him think about drinking. Not because he wanted to escape reality, but because reality sometimes felt too heavy to carry alone. Jim was waiting in a corner booth when Frank arrived. 2 cups of coffee already on the table. Jim was 73, a retired auto worker who'd been sober for 26 years. He'd seen everything, heard every excuse, and had a way of cutting through bullshit that Frank found both terrifying and comforting. "Talk," Jim said. Frank told him everything. The affair, the abortion, Margaret's visit, the choice between truth and peace. Jim listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. "So," Jim said when Frank finished, "you're asking me whether your daughter deserves to know her mother killed her baby brother to please a man who was lying to her. When you put it like that, it sounds pretty clear-cut. Does it? Because I'm hearing a man who's afraid his daughter will judge her mother the way he's been judging himself for 20 years. Frank looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" You've been carrying guilt for something that wasn't your fault. Now you're afraid Sarah will have to carry guilt for something that wasn't her fault either. But Frank, the guilt was never yours to carry, and it's not Sarah's either. But if she knows the truth, she'll have to process it, just like you're processing it now, just like you processed finding out about the affair 20 years ago. Jim leaned forward. The question isn't whether Sarah can handle the truth. The question is whether you can handle watching her handle it. Frank stared into his coffee. She's been through so much already. The divorce, the kids adjusting, building a relationship with me after 15 years. And she survived all of that because she's strong. Because you raised her to be strong, even when you couldn't be strong yourself. Linda raised her. I was drunk. You think Sarah learned her strength from Linda? The woman who made decisions based on fear and desperation? Jim shook his head. Sarah learned her strength from watching you fail and get back up, from watching you hit bottom and climb out, from watching you disappear for 15 years and then have the courage to come back. Frank considered this. So you think I should tell her? I think you should ask yourself why you're even considering not telling her. Because I love her. Because I want to protect her. Or because you're afraid she'll think less of you for keeping another secret. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Frank had kept the secret of Linda's affair for 15 years, telling himself it was to protect Sarah. But really, he'd been protecting himself from Sarah's anger, from having to explain his drinking, from having to be the villain in Linda's story. Maybe both, Frank admitted. That's honest. Now ask yourself this. If Sarah finds out about this from someone else, how will she feel about the fact that you knew and didn't tell her? Frank thought about Margaret Hendricks and her daughter Jessica, about the lawsuit that might make all of this public anyway. She'll feel betrayed. Again. Probably. And will keeping this secret bring her peace, or will it just be another lie she has to unravel later? Frank knew the answer. But saying it out loud felt like signing his daughter's death warrant. Another lie. Then you know what you have to do. Chapter 10. The Hardest Truth. Frank called Sarah that evening and asked if they could meet for coffee the next morning. Just the two of them. Is everything okay? Sarah asked, the same question she'd asked earlier, but with more concern this time. We need to talk about your mother. There was a long pause. Dad, if this is about the affair, we've been through that. I've made my peace with it. It's not about the affair, not exactly, but it's related. Okay, the usual place, 10 o'clock? Actually, could we meet at my house? This is private. Sarah's voice became very careful. Should I be worried? You should be prepared for something difficult. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Frank's house with coffee for both of them and a box of Emma's favorite donuts. Bribery, she explained. In case you're about to tell me something that ruins my day. They sat in Frank's living room, surrounded by pictures of the life they'd built together over the past 2 years. Sarah looked nervous but determined, like she was steeling herself for bad news. A woman came to see me yesterday, Frank began. Margaret Hendricks. She was married to Richard. Sarah's face went pale. Richard? Mom's? Yes. Margaret found some things when Richard died last month, letters from your mother, and she told me something I didn't know about the baby your mother lost. Frank told her everything, about the abortion, about Richard's ultimatum, about Linda's guilt and regret. He showed her the letter, watched her face as she read her mother's words. Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished. She held the letter in her hands, reading it over and over. She chose him over the baby, Sarah said finally. She chose what she thought was love over everything else, and she regretted it for the rest of her life. Is that supposed to make it better? Frank reached for his daughter's hand, but she pulled away. No, sweetheart, nothing makes it better, but it explains some things. Like what? Like why your mother was so angry all the time, why she blamed me for everything that went wrong, why she could never forgive herself enough to be happy. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, the same window where Frank had stood yesterday while Margaret told him the truth. So my entire childhood was shaped by my mother's guilt over killing her own baby. Your childhood was shaped by two people who made terrible decisions and didn't know how to live with the consequences. Don't, Sarah said sharply. Don't make this about you, too. Don't make this about your drinking or your guilt or your abandonment issues. This is about my mother choosing to end a pregnancy, to please a man who was lying to her. Frank absorbed the anger, recognizing it for what it was, the same rage he'd felt when he first found out about the affair. "You're right," he said. "This is about your mother's choice, and it was a terrible choice. But Sarah, she was being manipulated by a predator. Richard Hendricks used his power over women to make them do things they would never have done otherwise. That doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. But it explains it." Sarah turned from the window, her eyes bright with tears. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday." "And before that? Did you know it wasn't really a miscarriage?" "No. I believed what your mother told me. I blamed myself for causing the miscarriage because of the stress of fighting about the affair." Sarah laughed bitterly. "So we've both been carrying guilt for something that was entirely Mom's doing. And Richard's doing. Don't forget that he's the one who gave her the ultimatum. Richard's dead. Mom's dead. But I'm here, and Tyler and Emma are here, and now we all have to live with this knowledge." Frank stood up and walked toward his daughter, stopping a few feet away. "We don't all have to live with it. Tyler and Emma don't need to know. But I do? I get to carry this secret for the rest of my life? You get to decide what to do with it. Just like I got to decide what to do with the knowledge of the affair." Sarah stared at him. "And what did you do with it? You drank yourself into 15 years of self-destruction." "That's right. I handled it poorly. But you're stronger than I was. Smarter. You'll handle it better." "How can you be so sure?" "Because you've already survived worse things and come out the other side. Because you built a successful career while raising 2 kids largely on your own. Because you had the courage to reach out to your broken father and rebuild a relationship from scratch." Frank took a step closer. "Because you're nothing like your mother, Sarah. You're everything she could have been if she hadn't let fear make her decisions." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to process this." "You don't have to process it all at once. Take your time. Talk to someone if you need to, a therapist, a friend, whoever helps you think through difficult things." "Why did you tell me? You could have kept this secret too." Frank thought about his conversation with Jim, about the choice between protection and truth. "Because I love you too much to lie to you again, and because Margaret Hendricks' daughter is planning to go public with accusations against Richard's estate. Your mother's name is going to come up. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me, for not making me find out from some lawyer or news report." They stood in Frank's living room, father and daughter, surrounded by the evidence of their rebuilt relationship, photos and artwork and the comfortable clutter of a family that had chosen each other. "Dad?" "Yeah? I need some time to think about this. I might not be great company for a while." "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" Frank thought about all the promises he'd broken over the years, all the ways he'd failed his daughter when she needed him most. "I promise. Whatever happens, however you feel about this, I'm not going anywhere." Sarah hugged him then, fiercely, desperately, like she was holding on to the one solid thing in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." Chapter 11, The Ripple Effect. 3 weeks passed. Sarah continued their Saturday morning coffee meetings, but she was quieter, more distant. She asked Frank not to mention the revelation to Tyler and Emma until she decided how to handle it. Frank threw himself into work at the hardware store and his evening classes. He was taking business law now, partly to understand Sarah's world better and partly to keep his mind occupied. But every night, he found himself staring at his phone, wanting to call his daughter, wanting to fix what couldn't be fixed. It was Jim who finally told him to stop waiting. "You told her the truth," Jim said during one of their coffee meetings. "Now you have to let her decide what to do with it. Hovering isn't helping." "I'm not hovering, I'm being available." "You're being anxious, and anxiety is contagious. Sarah's dealing with enough without absorbing your worry too." Frank knew Jim was right, but knowing and accepting were different things. Then Sarah called on a Wednesday evening. "Dad, can you come over? I need to talk to you about something." Sarah's house in Bloomfield Hills was everything Frank's childhood home hadn't been. Spacious, well-appointed, carefully maintained. Sarah met him at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a determined expression. "Tyler and Emma are at David's for the week," she said. "We can talk freely." They sat in Sarah's living room, all cream-colored furniture and tasteful art that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Frank always felt slightly out of place here, like he might accidentally break something expensive. "I've been thinking," Sarah said without preamble, "about Mom, about Richard, about all of it. And I've made a decision." She took a deep breath. "I want to contact Margaret Hendricks. I want to support her daughter's lawsuit." Frank blinked. "Sarah, hear me out. I've been angry at Mom for 3 weeks, furious. I've been thinking about how her choice affected everything. Your drinking, our family falling apart, the 15 years we lost. That's understandable. But then I started thinking about the other women Richard manipulated, about how many lives he ruined with his ultimatums and lies, and I realized that Mom was a victim too." Frank studied his daughter's face. There was something different there, a clarity that hadn't been present 3 weeks ago. "She made a terrible choice," Sarah continued, "but she made it under coercion, from a position of emotional vulnerability. And she paid for it every day for the rest of her life." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that instead of being angry at a dead woman who can't defend herself, I want to help make sure Richard Hendricks can't hurt anyone else, even posthumously." Frank felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. "The lawsuit will be public, Sarah. Your mother's name will be in the papers. Tyler and Emma will find out." "I know, and I've thought about that too." Sarah pulled a folder from the side table. "I've been doing research, legal research. If we handle this right, Mom doesn't have to be portrayed as a villain. She can be portrayed as what she was, another victim of a predatory man who used his power to manipulate vulnerable women." Frank looked at the folder, thick with printouts and legal documents. "You've been busy. I've been focused. There's a difference." Sarah opened the folder. "Margaret's daughter, Jessica, isn't the only victim. I found records of at least 6 other women who worked for Richard over the years. 3 of them filed harassment complaints that were quietly settled. 2 of them left their jobs abruptly with no explanation." "How did you find all this?" "I'm a lawyer, Dad, and I'm very good at research." Sarah's smile was grim. "I also may have called in a few favors from colleagues who specialize in employment law." Frank shook his head. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. You don't have to put yourself through a public legal battle to vindicate your mother. I'm not doing it for Mom. I'm doing it for the women who are still alive, for Jessica Hendricks, who's been carrying shame that isn't hers to carry, for the women who might still be vulnerable to men like Richard." "And for yourself?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Maybe I need to do something positive with this knowledge, instead of just carrying it around like a wound." Frank reached across the space between them and took his daughter's hand. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Even if it means our family's private business becomes public? Even then. But Sarah, what about Tyler and Emma? How are you going to explain this to them?" "The same way you explained your drinking to me when I was old enough to understand. Honestly, age-appropriately. and with emphasis on the fact that people can make bad choices and still be worthy of love. Frank squeezed her hand. They're lucky to have you as a mother. I'm lucky to have you as a father. Finally. Chapter 12. Justice and Healing. 6 months later, Frank sat in a courtroom in downtown Detroit watching his daughter question a witness. The case against Richard Hendricks' estate had attracted national attention. A powerful real estate developer posthumously accused of using his position to coerce young women into sexual relationships and, in some cases, abortions. Sarah wasn't representing Jessica Hendricks directly. That would have been a conflict of interest given her mother's involvement, but she was serving as a consultant to the legal team, helping them understand the psychological patterns of manipulation that Richard had used. Tyler and Emma sat beside Frank in the gallery. They'd taken the news about their grandmother better than anyone had expected. Emma, now 11, had simply said, "So, Grandma Linda made a mistake and felt really bad about it?" Tyler, 14 and increasingly thoughtful, had asked more complex questions about consent and power dynamics that made Frank proud of his grandson's developing moral compass. Margaret Hendricks was on the witness stand, describing the documents she'd found after her husband's death. Her daughter Jessica sat in the front row, flanked by 3 other women who'd come forward with similar stories. The pattern was always the same, Margaret testified. Richard would identify young women in vulnerable positions, new employees, women with financial difficulties, women going through personal crises. He would offer them special attention, mentorship, promises of advancement, and then, when they became emotionally dependent on him, he would begin making demands. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man who reminded Frank uncomfortably of Richard himself, rose to cross-examine. "Mrs. Hendricks, isn't it true that you're testifying against your deceased husband because you're angry about his affairs? Isn't this really about revenge rather than justice?" Margaret looked the attorney straight in the eye. "I was married to Richard for 34 years. I knew about his affairs. What I didn't know was that he was using his power to coerce young women into sexual relationships and then forcing them to end pregnancies when it became inconvenient for him. But you have no direct evidence that any of these women were coerced." "I have letters," Margaret interrupted, "dozens of them. Letters from women begging Richard to keep his promises. Letters expressing guilt and regret over decisions they made under his influence. Letters that make it clear these women were not willing participants in equal relationships." The attorney tried a different approach. "These alleged relationships happened decades ago. Why should the court believe the testimony of women who waited so long to come forward?" Sarah stood up from the consulting table. "Objection, Your Honor. The question assumes facts not in evidence and mischaracterizes the nature of sexual coercion and its psychological effects." "Sustained," the judge ruled. "Counselor, please rephrase your question." Frank watched his daughter with pride. She'd prepared for this moment for months, studying every case file, every piece of evidence, every psychological profile of Richard's victims. She understood better than anyone what it meant to carry the weight of family secrets. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, the jury found that Richard Hendricks' estate was liable for damages to 4 of the women who testified. The monetary award was substantial, but more importantly, the verdict sent a message about accountability and the long-term consequences of abuse of power. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with Jessica Hendricks and the other plaintiffs, fielding questions from reporters. "Ms. Morrison, your mother was also involved with Mr. Hendricks. How has that affected your perspective on this case?" Sarah looked directly into the camera. "My mother was another victim of Richard Hendricks' manipulation. She made a decision she regretted for the rest of her life because a powerful man gave her an ultimatum designed to serve his interests, not hers. No woman should have to face that kind of coercion. No family should have to live with the consequences of one man's abuse of power." "Do you think your mother would have supported this lawsuit?" Sarah smiled sadly. I think my mother would have wanted other women to have the support and validation she never received. I think she would have wanted the truth to come out, even if it was painful. That evening, Frank, Sarah, Tyler, and Emma went to dinner at a small Italian restaurant. Not the fancy place where Frank and Sarah had been reunited, but a family-owned spot where the pasta was homemade and the owner remembered your name. "So," Tyler said, cutting into his chicken parmigiana, "are we famous now?" "Infamous, maybe," Sarah replied, "but hopefully for good reasons." "I'm proud of you, Mom," Emma said seriously. "You helped those ladies." "I helped myself too," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes doing the right thing for other people is the best way to heal yourself." Frank raised his water glass. "To doing the right thing, even when it's hard." "To family," Sarah added. "The one we're born into and the one we choose to become." They clinked glasses. Water for Frank, who would celebrate 10 years of sobriety next month, wine for Sarah, soda for the kids, a family built from broken pieces, held together by truth and love and the courage to face difficult realities. Epilogue. 5 years later, Frank Morrison's 71st birthday party was held in the backyard of his house in Royal Oak, the same backyard where Tyler had taught him to throw a curveball. Tyler was now 19, home from college for the summer and working part-time at Morrison & Son Hardware, while he decided whether to study business or sports medicine. Emma, 16, was driving now, a fact that terrified Frank more than anything he'd faced in the past decade. Sarah had remarried the previous year, a fellow attorney named Michael who understood the complexities of blended families and the importance of second chances. Michael's 2 daughters from his first marriage got along well with Tyler and Emma, creating the kind of large, chaotic family gatherings Frank had never imagined he'd be part of. The Hendricks case had been settled years ago, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Jessica Hendricks had started a nonprofit organization supporting women who'd experienced workplace sexual coercion. Sarah served on the board and spoke regularly at conferences about the intersection of family trauma and professional healing. Margaret Hendricks had become an unlikely friend. She often joined their family gatherings, having found in Frank and Sarah the kind of honesty and acceptance she'd never experienced during her marriage to Richard. "You know," Margaret said, sitting beside Frank on his back porch as they watched the grandchildren play in the yard, "Richard would have hated this." "What? The happiness?" "The truth. The fact that his victims found each other and found healing. He counted on shame and isolation to keep his secret safe." Frank watched Emma help Michael's youngest daughter with her batting stance, Tyler coaching them both with the patience Frank had taught him. "Secrets have a way of coming out eventually," Frank said. "Usually when you least expect them. Do you ever regret it? Learning the truth about Linda? Telling Sarah?" Frank considered the question. The past 5 years hadn't been easy. Sarah had gone through periods of anger, grief, and confusion as she processed the reality of her mother's choices. Tyler and Emma had struggled to understand how their beloved grandmother could have made such a painful decision. The family had been through therapy, both individual and group, working through the complicated legacy of trauma and healing. But they'd worked through it together, as a family. "No," Frank said finally, "I don't regret it. The truth was hard, but lies are harder. They eat away at you from the inside." "Even when the truth hurts innocent people?" Tyler and Emma aren't innocent because they were protected from the truth. They're strong because they learned how to process difficult realities with support and love. Margaret nodded. Jessica says the same thing, that knowing the truth, even painful truth, gave her back her power. Across the yard, Sarah called everyone in for cake. Frank's birthday cake was decorated with a hardware store theme, complete with fondant hammers and screwdrivers that Emma had insisted on making herself. It was silly and sweet and perfect. As Frank blew out his 71 candles, surrounded by the family he'd thought he'd lost forever, He made the same wish he'd made every year for the past 7 years, for the courage to keep choosing truth over comfort, love over fear, and connection over protection. The lottery ticket had given him financial security, but the dinner invitation, Sarah's courage to reach out, his courage to respond honestly, had given him everything that mattered. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were washed, Frank sat in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a rocking chair he was making for Sarah's new baby, due in the fall, a surprise pregnancy that had everyone excited and nervous. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thank you for today, Dad, and for every day since that dinner at Antonio's. I love you." Frank typed back, "Love you too, sweetheart. See you tomorrow for Emma's game. Wouldn't miss it. P.S. I'm naming the baby Frank if it's a boy. You better not, too late, already decided. Frank Morrison Chen has a nice ring to it." Frank smiled, imagining a new grandchild to spoil, a new generation to teach about truth and forgiveness, and the complicated beauty of family. He turned off the workshop light and headed upstairs to his comfortable house, his comfortable life, his comfortable relationship with the daughter who'd given him a second chance at being the father he'd always wanted to be. Outside, Detroit hummed with the quiet energy of a summer evening. Somewhere in the city, other families were struggling with their own secrets, their own pain, their own chances for redemption. Frank Morrison had learned that you don't get to choose the family you're born into, but you do get to choose the family you become. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, those two families can learn to be the same thing. The lottery money was still in the bank, barely touched except for the house and the college funds and the quiet donations to causes Sarah cared about. But the real jackpot, the one that couldn't be measured in dollars, was sleeping peacefully in houses across the metro area, dreaming dreams that Frank would be part of for the rest of his life. He'd won the lottery twice, once with numbers on a ticket and once with the courage to answer his daughter's phone call and tell her the truth. The second prize had been worth infinitely more. Chapter 13, The Next Generation. 7 years after Frank's 71st birthday, the Morrison family had grown in ways no one could have predicted. Sarah's son with Michael, little Frank, who insisted everyone call him Frankie to distinguish him from his grandfather, was now 6 years old and the undisputed king of the family. Tyler had graduated from business school and officially become the son in Morrison & Son Hardware, bringing new energy and technology to the store while respecting its traditional values. Emma was in her final year at University of Michigan, studying social work with a focus on family therapy. It was Emma who brought the next challenge to the family. "Grandpa," she said during one of their regular Sunday dinners, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Frank looked up from his plate of pot roast, Sarah's attempt to recreate Linda's recipe, which had become a family tradition. "Shoot, princess. I'm doing my senior thesis on intergenerational trauma and family healing. I want to write about our family." The table went quiet. Sarah set down her fork. Michael cleared his throat. Tyler looked between his sister and grandfather with the expression he'd worn as a child when Emma was about to get in trouble. "What kind of writing?" Frank asked carefully. "Academic research, but also..." Emma hesitated. "I want to write a book about how families can heal from secrets and lies, about how truth, even painful truth, can set people free." Sarah spoke first. "Emma, our story is pretty specific and pretty personal. That's what makes it powerful, Mom. How many families are carrying secrets that are poisoning them? How many kids grow up thinking their parents' problems are their fault? How many people spend years blaming themselves for things that were never their responsibility?" Frank studied his granddaughter's face. At 22, Emma had her mother's determination and her grandmother, Linda's passionate intensity, but tempered with something neither of the older women had possessed, a deep well of compassion that seemed to extend to everyone around her. "You want to tell the whole story?" Frank asked. The affair, the abortion, my drinking, the 15 years of silence. I want to tell the story of how a family broke apart and put itself back together, how secrets kept people isolated and how truth brought them home. Even if it means exposing all our private business to strangers? Emma leaned forward. Grandpa, do you know how many people have come up to Mom over the years because of the Hendricks case? How many women have thanked her for speaking out about workplace coercion and family trauma? Frank looked at Sarah, who nodded. It's true, Dad. I get emails constantly from people who saw the news coverage or read about the case online. Women who recognized their own stories in what we shared. And not just women, Tyler added. I've had guys at college tell me they respected how our family handled everything, how we didn't try to hide from our problems or pretend everything was perfect. Michael, who'd been quiet through the conversation, finally spoke. Frank, when Sarah told me about your family's history, it's part of what made me fall in love with her. Not the trauma, but the way you all chose healing over hiding. The way you decided to be honest about your imperfections. 6-year-old Frankie, who'd been coloring at the end of the table, looked up. Are we famous? Not famous, buddy, Emma said. Just honest. Frank sat back in his chair, looking around the table at the family that had grown from 2 broken people having dinner in a fancy restaurant 9 years ago. Sarah and Michael, married 3 years now and still obviously in love. Tyler, confident and kind. Everything Frank had hoped his grandson would become. Emma, passionate about justice and healing, ready to take on the world's problems. And little Frankie, innocent and curious, growing up in a family that valued truth over comfort. What would you want to accomplish with this book? Frank asked Emma. I want other families to know they don't have to stay broken, that secrets don't protect people. They isolate them. That it's possible to forgive without forgetting, to heal without pretending the damage never happened. And you think our story can do that? I think our story already is doing that. I just want to help it reach more people. Frank looked at Sarah. What do you think, sweetheart? Sarah reached for Michael's hand. I think Emma's right. I think we've been given something valuable. Not just our healing, but our story of healing. Maybe we have a responsibility to share it. Even the ugly parts? Especially the ugly parts. That's where the real healing happens. Frank turned to Tyler. What about you? You okay with your family's business being in a book? Tyler grinned. Are you kidding? I'll be the grandson of a published author. That's pretty cool. And you, little man, Frank asked Frankie, you okay with Aunt Emma writing about our family? Frankie looked up seriously. Will there be pictures? Probably, Emma said. Cool. Can I be on the cover? The adults laughed, and Frank felt the familiar warmth that came with these family dinners, the sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. Okay, he said finally, but I have conditions. Emma pulled out a notebook, ready to take notes. First, we all get to read everything before it's published. If anyone's uncomfortable with anything, we talk about it. Agreed. Second, we change enough details to protect people's privacy. Names, locations, specific circumstances. The emotional truth stays the same, but we don't expose innocent people. Of course. Third, any money from the book goes to Jessica Hendricks' nonprofit. We're not profiting from our pain or anyone else's. Emma's eyes filled with tears. That's perfect, Grandpa. And fourth, Frank continued, you make sure people understand that healing isn't a straight line, that we still have bad days, that forgiveness is a choice you have to make over and over again, not something that happens once and lasts forever. I will, I promise. Frank looked around the table one more time. Then I guess we're writing a book. Chapter 14. The Writing Process. The next 18 months were both cathartic and exhausting. Emma interviewed each family member extensively, recording hours of conversations about memories, feelings, and perspectives on events that had shaped their lives. She spoke with Margaret Hendricks, Jessica, and several of the other women from the lawsuit. She consulted with therapists, legal experts, and researchers who specialized in family trauma and healing. Frank found the process harder than he'd expected. Revisiting his drinking years, his 15-year absence from Sarah's life, his failure to be the father and grandfather he'd wanted to be, it all brought back feelings he thought he'd resolved. "Some nights, I dream about drinking," he told Jim during one of their coffee meetings. "Not because I want to drink, but because I'm reliving the shame of who I was back then." "That's normal," Jim said. "Trauma has a way of resurfacing when you poke at it, even for good reasons. I just don't want to drag the family backward while Emma's trying to help other families move forward." "Are you drinking?" "No." "Are you going to meetings?" 3 times a week." "Are you talking to Sarah about how you're feeling?" Frank hesitated. "Some." "Frank, your family chose to do this together. That means you don't have to carry the hard parts alone. Talk to them. Let them help you the way you've been helping them." It was good advice, and Frank took it. That evening, he called Sarah and asked if they could talk. "I'm struggling with some of the memories Emma's interviews are bringing up," he said. "I don't want my struggles to interfere with her project." "Dad, your struggles are part of the story. The fact that healing is ongoing, that it requires work and support, that's important for people to understand." "But what if I can't handle it? What if talking about all this triggers a relapse?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to drink?" "No, but I want to escape. I want to stop feeling all this old pain." "Then we'll help you find healthy ways to process it. Therapy, meetings, family support, whatever you need." "You'd do that? Even though it might complicate Emma's book?" "Dad, wait. Shout. The book isn't more important than your sobriety. Nothing is more important than your sobriety." The conversation reminded Frank why he'd fought so hard to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. Sarah had grown into the kind of person who prioritized people over projects, relationships, over achievements. The book took shape slowly. Emma wrote with the precision of a trained researcher, but the heart of someone who'd lived the story she was telling. She focused on the psychological dynamics of family secrets, the ways trauma passed from generation to generation, and the deliberate choices required to break destructive patterns. "The Morrison family story," she wrote in her introduction, "is not unique in its dysfunction. What makes it remarkable is their collective decision to choose truth over comfort, healing over hiding, and connection over protection. This is a story about the courage required to face family history honestly and the grace required to forgive without forgetting." Chapter 15. Publication and Reflection. Healing in the Light, A Family's Journey from Secrets to Truth, was published by a university press on a Tuesday in October, exactly 10 years after Frank and Sarah's reunion dinner at Antonio's. The book received positive reviews from family therapy journals and was featured in several national magazines as an example of how families could address intergenerational trauma. More importantly, it began reaching the people Emma had hoped to help. Letters and emails poured in from readers who recognized their own families in the Morrison story. Adult children who'd been estranged from parents due to family secrets. Parents who'd been carrying guilt over decisions made decades earlier. Families struggling with addiction, infidelity, financial problems, and the isolation that came with trying to handle everything privately. "Your family's courage to tell the truth gave me permission to tell mine," wrote a woman from Oregon whose father had hidden his gambling addiction for 20 years. "We're in family therapy now, and for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I actually know my parents." Frank received his own letters, many from men who'd struggled with addiction and abandonment of their families. The hardest ones to read were from fathers who'd lost contact with their children and didn't know how to reach out. "I've been sober for 3 years," wrote a man from Texas, "but I still haven't called my daughter. Your story makes me think maybe it's not too late. Maybe she'd be willing to have coffee and let me try to explain." Frank answered every letter personally. encouraging the fathers to take the risk of reaching out while emphasizing that their children had no obligation to respond. "The worst thing that can happen," he wrote to the man from Texas, "is that she'll say no. But if you don't try, the answer is definitely no. At least if you call, there's a chance." 6 months after publication, Emma organized a book signing at Morrison & Son Hardware. The small store was packed with customers, neighbors, family friends, and people who'd driven from hours away to meet the family behind the story. Margaret Hendricks was there, now in her 80s, but still sharp and engaged. Jessica Hendricks brought her teenage daughter, who was considering studying psychology. Several of the women from the lawsuit attended, along with their families. "It's strange," Sarah said to Frank as they watched Emma sign books and talk with readers, "seeing our private story become public property." Good strange or bad strange? Both. I'm proud of what we've built together. Proud of Emma for finding a way to help other families, but part of me misses when it was just ours. Frank understood. The book had brought their story to people who needed it, but it had also made their healing journey visible to strangers who might judge their choices or misunderstand their motivations. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Sarah watched Emma talking with a young woman who was crying as she described her own family's struggles with secrets and addiction. "No," Sarah said finally. "Look at that. Look at Emma. Helping that girl understand that her father's problems aren't her fault. How can I regret something that creates moments like that?" Tyler, now managing the store full-time while Frank focused on writing responses to readers, joined their conversation. "You know what's weird?" he said. "I've had customers tell me they shop here because they want to support our family after reading the book, like our store has become a symbol of something." "Of what?" Frank asked. "Second chances, I guess. The idea that people can change, that families can heal, that business can be about more than just making money." Frank looked around the hardware store he'd bought with lottery winnings, now run by his grandson and frequented by people who saw it as more than just a place to buy tools and supplies. It had become a gathering place for people who valued honesty, healing, and second chances. "That's not such a bad legacy," he said. Chapter 16. The Unexpected Return. 2 years after the book's publication, Frank was working in his garden when a car he didn't recognize pulled into his driveway. A woman got out, mid-40s, professionally dressed, with nervous energy that reminded him of Sarah before difficult conversations. "Mr. Morrison," she called, "my name is Lisa Chen. I'm David's sister." Frank's hand stilled on the tomato plants he'd been staking. David, Sarah's ex-husband, the man who'd cheated and left her a single mother. "What can I do for you, Miss Chen?" Lisa approached the garden gate carefully, like she was approaching a potentially aggressive animal. "I read your granddaughter's book about your family's healing process, and I wanted to talk to you about David." Frank stood up, wiping dirt from his hands on his jeans. "Miss Chen, whatever's going on with David, it's not really my business anymore. He and Sarah have been divorced for almost 8 years. "I know. But this affects Tyler and Emma, and I thought maybe you could help me figure out how to handle it." Frank gestured toward his back porch. "Why don't we sit down?" Lisa settled into one of the rocking chairs Frank had built, accepting a glass of iced tea and gathering her courage. "David's sick," she said finally. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say he has maybe 6 months." Frank felt a complicated mix of emotions. Sadness for Tyler and Emma, who still saw their father regularly despite his flaws. Relief that this wasn't his crisis to manage. And unexpected sympathy for a man he'd never particularly liked. "I'm sorry to hear that," Frank said. "Have Tyler and Emma been told?" "Not yet. David's been trying to figure out how to tell them, but that's not why I'm here." Lisa set down her iced tea and looked directly at Frank. "David wants to make amends, not just to Sarah and the kids, but to everyone his choices affected. He's been in therapy, trying to understand why he cheated, why he was so destructive. And he's realized that his affair didn't just hurt Sarah. It hurt Tyler and Emma's relationship with her. It complicated their ability to trust relationships. It damaged the whole family system, Frank finished. I understand that. But Lisa, I'm not the person David needs to make amends to. Actually, you are. Partly. Frank raised an eyebrow. David knows that his affair is part of what drove Sarah to reconnect with you. He knows that your family's healing happened, in part, because his betrayal forced Sarah to realize she needed her father in her life. That's a complicated way to look at it. But it's not wrong, is it? If David hadn't cheated, if their marriage had been stable, would Sarah have reached out to you when you won the lottery? Frank considered the question. Maybe not. Or maybe not then. But I like to think we would have found our way back to each other eventually. David doesn't think so. He thinks his betrayal was the catalyst that made Sarah vulnerable enough to take the risk of calling you. So what's he asking for? Forgiveness for inadvertently helping my family heal? Lisa smiled sadly. He's asking for a chance to apologize for the collateral damage his choices caused. To you, specifically. For the years of guilt you carried thinking you were the reason Sarah struggled with relationships. Frank stared at Lisa. What are you talking about? David knows that Sarah blamed herself for choosing him, a man who would eventually betray her, because she was afraid of turning out like her mother. He knows she told you once that she was worried she had bad judgment about men because of what she witnessed growing up. The memory hit Frank like a physical blow. Sarah, crying in his kitchen 3 years ago, wondering if her tendency to choose emotionally unavailable men stemmed from watching her parents' dysfunctional marriage. David wants you to know that Sarah's choice to marry him had nothing to do with you or your drinking or your marriage to her mother. He was manipulative and charming, and he deliberately targeted women who were successful but had father issues. Frank set down his iced tea. He what? David's been in therapy for 2 years, working with someone who specializes in infidelity and emotional manipulation. He's come to understand that he specifically sought out women who were high-achieving but had complicated relationships with their fathers, women who would be impressed by his attention but wouldn't push too hard for emotional intimacy. He targeted Sarah because her father was a drunk. He targeted Sarah because she was successful, beautiful, and carried just enough father-related insecurity to make her grateful for his attention, without expecting too much emotional availability. Frank felt anger rising in his chest, not the old, helpless rage of his drinking years, but clean, protective fury on behalf of his daughter. And he wants to tell me this why? To make me feel worse about how my drinking affected Sarah's ability to trust men? No, Lisa said quickly. He wants to tell you this so you understand that Sarah's choice to marry him wasn't a reflection of damage you caused. It was the result of his deliberate manipulation of normal human vulnerabilities. Frank stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd built a new life with his family. Miss Chen, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this feels like David trying to manage his guilt by spreading it around. Maybe. Or maybe it's a dying man trying to make sure the people he hurt understand the full scope of what he did. Frank turned back to Lisa. What does Sarah think about all this? She doesn't know. David asked me to talk to you first, to see if you'd be willing to hear what he has to say before he approaches her. And if I say no, then he won't contact any of you. He'll handle his illness privately and leave your family alone. Frank considered this. His first instinct was to protect Sarah and the kids from more drama, especially drama involving David's mortality and guilt. But his second instinct, the one he'd learned to trust over the past decade, was that truth, even painful truth, was usually better than protective silence. I'll think about it, he said finally. But Lisa, if David wants to make amends, he needs to understand that amends aren't about making himself feel better. They're about taking responsibility for harm caused and asking what he can do to repair it. I'll tell him that, And he needs to understand that none of us, not Sarah, not Tyler, not Emma, not me, owe him forgiveness or absolution. If he's looking for peace before he dies, he needs to find it somewhere other than our approval. Lisa nodded. I understand. And Mr. Morrison? Thank you for listening. I know this isn't your problem to solve. After Lisa left, Frank sat on his porch for a long time, thinking about the complicated web of choices and consequences that had shaped his family's story. David's betrayal, which had seemed like purely destructive selfishness, had indeed been part of what drove Sarah back to her father, but that didn't make David a hero or his choices forgivable. Frank called Jim. I need some perspective, he said, and told his sponsor about Lisa's visit. What's your gut telling you? Jim asked. That David's dying and scared and looking for absolution he doesn't deserve. And what's your heart telling you? Frank was quiet for a moment. That dying people deserve the chance to try to make things right, even if the people they hurt don't have to accept their efforts. There's your answer, which is, you'll know when you know. But Frank, whatever you decide, make sure it's about what's best for your family, not what makes you feel most righteous. That evening, Frank called Sarah and told her about Lisa's visit. Sarah listened without interrupting, asking only a few clarifying questions. What do you think I should do? Frank asked when he finished. I think, Sarah said slowly, that Tyler and Emma deserve to know their father is dying. And I think they deserve the chance to decide for themselves whether they want to hear his apologies. And what about you? I honestly don't know. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. Part of me feels sorry for him, and part of me is curious about what he thinks he needs to apologize for. You don't have to decide right now. No, but I need to decide soon. If he's really as sick as his sister says, waiting too long isn't an option. They talked for another hour, working through the complicated emotions that David's illness had stirred up. Eventually, they agreed that Frank would meet with David, not to grant forgiveness, but to hear what he had to say. After that, they'd decide as a family how to move forward. Dad, Sarah said before they hung up. Yeah? Whatever David says, whatever explanations he offers, it doesn't change our story. It doesn't change the fact that we found our way back to each other. It doesn't change the healing we've done. I know, sweetheart. Good, because I'm not letting a dying man's guilt disrupt the peace we've built. Frank smiled. His daughter had learned well how to protect what mattered while staying open to truth. It was a lesson that had taken him 75 years to master. Epilogue. Full circle. David Chen died on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks after Frank's conversation with his sister. Frank had met with him once in the hospice facility where David spent his final weeks. It had been a difficult conversation, David taking responsibility for his manipulative behavior. Frank listening without offering absolution, but ultimately helpful for everyone involved. Tyler and Emma had both visited their father before he died, each processing his apologies and explanations in their own way. Tyler, now 24 and mature beyond his years, had found a way to forgive his father while acknowledging the harm his choices had caused. Emma, 23 and preparing to graduate with her master's degree in social work, had used the experience as a learning opportunity about addiction, manipulation, and the complexity of human behavior. Sarah had chosen not to visit David, but she'd written him a letter that Tyler read aloud during one of his visits. The letter was honest about the pain David's affair had caused, while acknowledging that his betrayal had ultimately led to positive changes in her life. I can't thank you for cheating on me, she'd written, but I can acknowledge that your choices forced me to become stronger, more independent, and more willing to take risks for the relationships that really mattered. In a strange way, your betrayal was part of what brought my father back into my life. Frank was now 76, still healthy and active, still running Morrison & Son hardware with Tyler, still attending AA meetings 3 times a week. Emma's book had been translated into 6 languages and was being used in family therapy programs across the country. Sarah and Michael were happily married with 3 children, Frankie, now 9, and twin daughters born 2 years earlier. The Morrison family had become accidentally famous for their willingness to be honest about their imperfections and their commitment to healing rather than hiding. Frank regularly spoke at conferences about addiction and family reconciliation, always emphasizing that healing was a choice that had to be made over and over again. On the 10-year anniversary of his lottery win, Frank stood in his backyard watching 4 grandchildren play on the swing set Tyler had built. Sarah and Michael were grilling burgers, Emma was setting the picnic table, and Tyler was teaching little Frankie how to throw a slider. Margaret Hendricks, now 85 and still sharp, sat beside Frank on the porch. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question that had become a tradition at family gatherings. Frank thought about the question seriously, as he always did. 10 years ago, he'd been a lonely man in a small apartment, convinced his daughter was better off without him. Now he was surrounded by the noise and chaos of a large, complicated, loving family. "I regret the years I lost with Sarah," he said finally. "I regret that Tyler and Emma grew up not knowing their grandfather. I regret that Linda died believing she was unforgivable." "But you don't regret the lottery win?" Frank smiled. "The lottery win was just money, Margaret. The real prize was learning that it's never too late to tell the truth and ask for a second chance. And if Sarah hadn't called, if you'd kept the money and stayed alone, then I'd have been a rich, lonely old man instead of a poor, lonely old man. The money didn't change my life. The courage to answer Sarah's call did." Across the yard, Emma was corralling the children for cake, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years studying family dynamics. Tyler was helping Michael with the grill, the 2 men bonding over their shared love of Sarah and their mutual commitment to being better fathers than their own had been. Sarah was taking pictures, documenting another family gathering that would become part of their shared history. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from a reader of Emma's book, a father in California who'd just had his first conversation with his estranged daughter in 8 years. Frank would respond later, offering encouragement and reminding the man that reconciliation was a process, not an event. "Frank," Sarah called, "come light the candles." Frank stood up, his knees protesting more than they had 10 years ago, but his heart lighter than it had been in decades. He walked toward his family, the one he'd almost lost and the one he'd helped build from the ruins of his mistakes. The cake was store-bought this year, decorated with a simple message: family is forever. It wasn't elegant or expensive, but it was true. Family, the one you're born into and the one you choose to become, really was forever, if you were brave enough to fight for it. As Frank blew out the 76 candles, surrounded by the laughter and love of 3 generations, he thought about the man he'd been when Sarah first called him 10 years ago. That man had been broken, ashamed, convinced he had nothing to offer his daughter except disappointment. This man, the grandfather teaching his grandson to pitch, the father celebrating his daughter's success, the great-grandfather reading bedtime stories to twin toddlers, this man had learned that love was stronger than shame, that truth was more powerful than protection, and that it was never too late to become the person your family needed you to be. The lottery ticket had been worth $58 million before taxes. The phone call had been priceless, and the family that grew from that phone call, that was a jackpot that would keep paying dividends for generations to come. The end.